Okay, it should be recording, I think. Yes, all right. Welcome back. This is another one of my video explanations for you. Now this is topic 5, continued. So if you watched the last topic 5 video, we looked at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, or otherwise known as the shot heard around the world, which basically sparks the Revolutionary War. And now, so in the aftermath of the conflict, now Boston is under siege by the colonial New England militia, and that's where the British Army is trapped in a way and surrounded. And because of basically this conflict that has been sparked, the Second Continental Congress now meets earlier than was envisaged. They were meant to meet later in 1775, but they meet now earlier to figure out what to do in response to this conflict, this war basically that has now started. All right, I will share my screen. All right, so now in response, it's going to work. Yeah, so John Adams' perspective. So after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, Adams was convinced that the break with Britain was inevitable, and he said, "The die was cast, the Rubicon crossed." Whereas Joseph Warren, who was there at the Battle of Concord, says, "To the persecution and tyranny of George III's cruel ministry, we will not tamely submit. We're determined to die or be free." So, some historical interpretations, but that brings us now to the Second Continental Congress. So remember, the Battle of Lexington and Concord happens on the 19th of April, and now the siege of Boston is going on, and then the Second Continental Congress decides to meet. So kind of in desperation and kind of again to figure out how all of the colonies should respond to this. All right, now the purpose of the early meeting in Philadelphia at Independence Hall. This is where they meet. Now, 3 weeks after the dramatic events at Lexington and Concord, and now the ongoing siege of Boston, colonial delegates again meet for the Second Continental Congress to develop a coordinated response to the outbreak of armed hostilities. So, at the Second Continental Congress. Now, before we go on, what you have to know is that even though the dates that I showed you before say 10th of May, 1775 to the 4th of July, 1776, that's not when they stop meeting. That's just when our area of study ends, right? However, the Congress is now ongoing until the end of the Revolutionary War, which will be our first topic in area of study 2. Now, 10th of May, 48 members of the Continental Congress met for a second time in Philadelphia and remained in session throughout the entire war until 1783. Now, most from the first Congress attended, but with notable changes. Georgia was now represented, which means all 13 colonies are now represented. Thomas Jefferson joined Patrick Henry, Washington, and Richard Henry Lee from Virginia. So Thomas Jefferson is a notable addition. Benjamin Franklin was now part of the Pennsylvania delegation, and John Hancock was nominated as president of the Congress. That's John Hancock down here holding the Declaration of Independence with his name on it because he has the largest signature. Now, rather than being united by the events at Lexington and Concord, Congress was in turmoil actually about how to best proceed. There was some that were more radical, like Henry, like Richard Henry Lee, like John Adams, who wanted independence and basically to force Britain to give them their independence, so probably war in this case, whereas there was others like Dickinson, who was more moderate and wanted peace at any chance and reconciliation with the king at any chance. So the first decision that they make is the Continental Army. So after the Battle of Bunker Hill, British attempt to break the siege of Boston, and a month of debate ensures, and Congress then decides to form a Continental Army. Now, the Battle of Bunker Hill and the siege of Boston is what we will look at in Area of Study 2 during the Revolutionary War. But what you have to know is, when the Congress is in session, the Battle of Bunker Hill happens when the British try to break the siege in Boston. Now, the British win the battle, but they don't break the siege. So ultimately, it's a failure. And because of this battle, which is the second most notable battle that has happened so far, Congress decides that they need to turn this militia into an army. So the various colonial militia forces located in the country around Boston are now the official Continental Army. So they're just suddenly called the Continental Army, but they're not really an army yet. They're more like just a rabble militia, really. Now, what Congress does with this decision is that they legitimize military resistance. So it's not just a rebellion anymore. Now it's official military resistance, and which will lead to war. Now, on the 15th of June, Congress appointed George Washington as Commander-in-Chief, who you can see on both pictures here. One is where he's appointed Commander-in-Chief by the Congress, and the other one is where he rides to meet his new army. Now, Washington had actually attended the Congress every day in his militia uniform before being appointed. It was kind of like to give them a hint that he should be made, well, the commander. Here's a brief explanation as to why Washington was chosen as Commander-in-Chief that you can watch on your own accord. And here is another video hyperlink that I've made, which is a film representation, retrospective of Washington at the Congress, talking to John Adams and Richard Henry Lee. And his desire to be commander is shown in this clip that you can watch. All right. So the next thing that happens is Congress writes the Declaration of the Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms. So arms are weapons. So they've now declared the Continental Army. There's been the Battle of Bunker Hill, and Washington is made Commander-in-Chief, and he rides out to Boston. Now, in this declaration, they say why they have actually done this. So, in July, Congress also passed a Declaration of the Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms, which explains why the colonies had taken up arms to resist the British. Now, their grievances and the justifications included taxation without representation, the Coercive Acts, the Declaratory Act, how their grievances had been ignored for over 10 years. So remember, the grievances started in 1763, so with the Royal Proclamation Line, which was one of the consequences of the French and Indian War and the end of solitary neglect. Now, the Declaration of Causes insisted that arms were taken up due to in defense of freedom, and shall lay them arms down when hostilities cease on the part of the aggressor, Britain. So, what are they saying by this? They're saying the only reason they've taken up arms is in defense of their freedom, or in other words, defense of their liberty and their natural rights, and that they will lay down their weapons when Britain stops being the aggressor. So if Britain basically surrenders. The other thing that they issue is the olive branch petition. Now they do that shortly after. So what is the olive branch petition? Normally an olive branch is like a symbol of peace. So this is basically what this is. Now, many delegates to the Congress were not convinced that war with Britain was a good thing. So John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, who's one of the moderates, convinced Congress to write a petition for reconciliation to the king. Now, this became known as the Olive Branch Petition and is very significant. And it was kind of like the last-ditch attempt at reconciliation with Britain. Now, the petition pledged loyalty and sought peace. But even members of the Congress who signed the petition, particularly John Adams and Henry, like Sam Adams, like more the radical ones, thought it had little chance of success. But they did it anyway, because in the end, no one really wanted a war. They just basically wanted Britain to acknowledge their grievances and their rights. So, George III considered the Continental Congress illegal and treasonous. He refused to consider its many petitions and declarations. Now, delegates to the Congress would have been subject to a charge of treason if they were caught. Now, the Olive Branch petition to the king arrived after George III had already rejected reconciliation with the colonies. So he refused to even consider the petition. And the petition actually returned to Congress unopened. Now, on the 23rd of August, George III called on all his loyal subjects to help suppress the rebellion that was going on in America now. With firmness and perseverance, America will be brought to submission, is what he declared. So you can read this. You can watch this. George III's response to the Olive Branch petition is read out by John Hancock in Parliament. So it's what's being read out is his proclamation of rebellion, not really his response, but it was seen as a response. So you can watch that. Now, what is his response to the Olive Branch petition? So it basically is the proclamation of rebellion. So we have to see this as a response, even though the letter came back unopened. This is basically why it came back unopened. So the proclamation of rebellion. Now, was the response made by George III on the 23rd of August, 1775, on the news of the Battle of Bunker Hill in Boston. Now, the proclamation was drafted before the Olive Branch petition made by Congress to the king. Now, before the king refused to receive the colonial petition, the proclamation was read out and effectively served as the answer to the petition. So you have to see the proclamation of rebellion, where George III says that the colonies are in a state of rebellion and need to be suppressed. In that, he basically responds to Olive Branch petition. So because he says that they need to be suppressed, he's not going to really consider their petition. What's his perspective? So in his petition, George III declared that the American colonies are in an open and avowed rebellion. The utmost endeavours to withstand and suppress such rebellion are to be made. Now, what are the grievances towards George III? Now, George III was seen as directly implicated in the punitive acts passed by Parliament. He made no evident effort to stop such legislation by Parliament, and consequently opposition toward George III grew in the colonies. Now, the animosity reached its height following the Olive Branch petition. The hope was that the king might be able to repair the damaged relationship. This was the hope. So, the Olive Branch petition was basically, look, we don't want war. We're reaching out to you. We're telling you that we are loyal subjects. And all you have to do is recognize our grievances and we can come to an understanding. However, George did not consider this petition. Instead, he declared the colonies in a state of rebellion and that they need to be suppressed. In 1775, George III declared that the colonies were in the state of rebellion against Great Britain. Now, in terms of cause of revolution, it can be argued that George III was antagonistic towards the colonies, had outdated views, and failed to adequately respond to the needs and requests of his loyal colonial subjects. Now, we do have to say that they're loyal because of the Olive Branch petition and the Declaration of Rights and Grievances to the King, because they've done this before. Now, they always pledge loyalty to the King, and they always say they're not against the King, they don't want to rebel, they just want their rights to be heard. All right, now, what's the significance of this, particularly the Olive Branch petition? All right, so the colonists, through their Olive Branch petition, declared that they had always been loyal to the king, but that Parliament had no legitimate claim over them as they were not democratically represented. So basically anything that Parliament did, that they would rebel against. Now, it was the King's proclamation that undermined moderates in the Congress like John Dickinson, who argued that the King would come to the colonists' aid. Now, the proclamation made by the King made it clear that the King was against the colonists, and as a result, attachment to empire, so basically attachment to Great Britain, was weakened. A movement towards independence was thus strengthened, and both the Olive Branch petition, oops, there's double T there, and the King's proclamation of rebellion helped cause the eventual Declaration of Independence a year later. So this is the significance of the Olive Branch petition and the King's proclamation. All right, so what are the key decisions at the Second Continental Congress? All 13 colonies are represented and decided on the creation of the Continental Army. George Washington, main commander-in-chief, wrote the Declaration of Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms, wrote the Olive Branch petition, turned towards independence due to the failure of the petition and the King's proclamation of rebellion. And they decided to stay in session until the end of the war, which will be in 1783. Have a look at some perspectives. Benjamin Franklin at the Congress said, "Freedom is not a gift bestowed upon us by other men, but a right that belongs to us by the laws of nature." So now Commander-in-Chief George Washington said, "I wish to be useful in every kind necessary for the public good." So that's a very Republican virtue that he has there in becoming Commander-in-Chief. Now, of the Congress, Joseph Reed, on being hanged for treason, said, "When a subject draws his sword against the prince," so by saying prince, he actually means, the empire, so Britain, George III, "he must cut his way through if he means afterwards to sit down safely." So what he basically says, we're going to be hanged for treason, so we may as well go all the way. Patrick Henry, so of the Congress, in regards to liberty, said, "Wise men engaged in a great and arduous struggle for liberty." Sam Adams also regarding liberty at the Congress. So in regards to the Congress says, no people will tamely surrender their liberties, nor can any be easily subdued. All right. Let's have a look at some historical interpretations. Farmer says, the Congress had little choice but to take charge of the conduct of war, assuming responsibilities of the armies around Boston and to raise a Continental army. John Cantwell says, the king, before he had even seen the Olive Branch petition in August 1775, proclaimed that many of our subjects in diverse parts of the colonies have been misled by dangerous and ill-designed men. And that is our topic for today. Now, I might just leave you anyway with the King's Petition being read out by John Hancock. It's a film version of it, but I'll leave it there.
General Washington still awaits our reply to the problem of re-enlistments.
The King's seal.
Now, he respectfully suggests that a salary be granted our soldiers commensurate with their sacrifice.
But he has no money on hand to pay them. Tents, soap, shoes, and blankets are also greatly wanted. The Army recently took shipment of 50 crates of rifles, all without the flints required to shoot them.
The proclamation by King George III. Many of our subjects, misled by a desperate conspiracy of dangerous and ill-designing men, have forgotten the allegiance which they owe to the power that has protected and supported them, and have declared rebellion and traitorously levied war against us. It is the better part of wisdom to put a speedy end to such disorders. We have thought fit to issue our royal proclamation that all our royal officers, both civil and military, are obliged to suppress such rebellion and bring the traitors to justice. When the unhappy and deluded multitude against whom this force shall be directed shall become sensible of their error, I shall be ready to receive the misled with tenderness and mercy. For those who persist in their treason, the punishment shall be death by hanging.
All right, on that note, cheerio. Until next time.